This is a video lesson for Lesson 3 of Module 5. The learning target for this lesson is I can decompose non-unit fractions and represent them as a whole number times a unit fraction using tape diagrams. So if you will recall from last lesson, unit fractions are fractions that have 1 as the numerator and then some other number as the denominator. So 1/2 would be an example of a unit fraction, or 1/3, or 1/100th. Anything that has the 1 as a numerator is our unit fraction. So a non-unit fraction would be any fraction that has any number other than 1 as the numerator. So here are a few examples of some non-unit fractions. 2/3, 5/7, 217, 1,258, anything that has a non-1 as our numerator. So we're going to be looking how we can decompose these types of fractions as a product of unit fractions times a whole number. So that's a lot of big vocabulary words, so let's kind of jump into the first example and see what we're talking about with this lesson. So, starting with a tape diagram here, I'm going to look at this tape diagram and I see that the whole tape diagram is equal to one whole. And so my first step is I want to think of what are the unit fractions being represented in this tape diagram. So if I look at the whole tape diagram here, I see it split up into 4 equal parts. So I know that each unit, or the unit fraction, is going to be 1/4 because each of the parts is equal to 1/4. So I'm going to be decomposing the shaded portion here. So if I just look at the shaded portion here, I see that it is 1, 2, 3/4. So this is my non-unit fraction that I'm going to be decomposing. So from the tape diagram, I can see that 3/4 is equal to 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. So I just decompose 3/4 into 3 copies of the unit fraction. So now to represent this as a multiplication sentence, I simply need to see how many copies of the unit fraction I had, 3, and I'm going to multiply that by the unit fraction, 1/4. So 3 times 1/4 is the same as 3/4. So we're just pretty much looking at how we can look at non-unit fractions in a different way and see them as a product of the unit fraction times the number of copies of that unit fraction. This strategy can also be applied to fractions that are greater than 1. So let's slide down and look at our next problem here. So here we have a fraction that is greater than 1. You can see that the tape diagram, the 1 whole only represents part. We have this little bit of extra over here that's greater than a whole. But we can use the same process to decompose this fraction as well. So the first thing we want to do is figure out what unit fraction we're dealing with. So I'm going to look just at the 1 whole here, and I can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 equal parts represented in the whole. So I know that my unit fraction that I'm working with is 1/8. So this step isn't necessarily necessary, I guess, to write out all of these different unit fractions, but it helps to see what the value of each of the equal parts is. So now I know that my unit fraction is 1/8. I simply just need to count up how many of my unit fractions I have. So I have 8 unit fractions in the whole, and then I have 2 extras, so this gives me a total of 10/8. So to decompose this into an addition sentence, I just simply add up 10 copies of 1/8. So it takes a little bit of time here, but it's worth it to be able to look at these fractions in a different way. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so that's 1 whole. 9 copies and 10 copies. So 10/8 here is the same as all of these copies of 1/8 added to each other. And so to represent this as a multiplication sentence, I simply look at my unit fraction 1/8 and I look at the number of copies that I made. So I made 10 copies, and I'm going to multiply that by my unit fraction. So 10 copies of 1/8 is equal to 10/8. Now I know that some of you might be thinking, well, we can rewrite this fraction or this improper fraction as a mixed number, but we're going to worry about that concept for a later lesson. If you already know about changing improper fractions to mixed numbers, that's great, but for this lesson, we're only focused at looking at how we can decompose this fraction into a multiplication sentence. So that's it for that problem there. So let's take a look at one last problem where we're actually going to be required to draw the tape diagram. So we're not actually analyzing a tape diagram and writing the fraction and decomposing it, but we are given a fraction and we need to draw the tape diagram. So let's go ahead and take a look here. All right, so zoom out just a smidge so we can see. Excellent. So this problem asks us to draw a tape diagram of 5/3, then record the fractions decomposition into unit fractions as a multiplication sentence. So we know that the fraction's 5/3, so we need to think of what is our unit fraction going to be. Well, we look at the denominator here, so we know that our unit fraction is going to be 1 over the denominator, or 1 copy of the denominator. So our unit fraction in this case is going to be 1/3. And we are going to have 5 copies of 1/3. So our tape diagram, I did a little bit of cheating here. I actually created the tape diagram before I started the lesson here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab our tape diagram and move it up to our problem. Our tape diagram is going to look a little bit something like this. So we have our unit fraction of 1/3, and we can go ahead and record our unit fraction within each of the parts. And we can see once again that this is a fraction that is greater than 1 because we have 1 whole right here, and then we have this little bit of extra. So a little bit of extra added on to the 1 whole. So now that we've drawn our tape diagram, we need to record the fraction's decomposition into unit fractions as a multiplication sentence. So in order to do that, just like before, we need to take a look at what is our unit fraction, and we've been talking about how it is 1/3. And we need to say how many copies of 1/3 do we have. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of 1/3. So to record this decomposition as a multiplication sentence, we write 5 copies multiplied by 1/3, and this is equal to 5/3. So we can see the fraction, the non-unit fraction of 5/3 as 5 copies of 1/3. So as you can see, this lesson is all about just viewing fractions in a different way. Viewing a fraction like 5/3 as a multiplication sentence or as the sum of all of the different unit fractions. And so hopefully this gives you a better understanding of this concept of fractions. And you should be ready now to answer all the problems in the Lesson 3 problem set. But if you run into any trouble, feel free to come back, rewatch the video or certain parts of the video to give yourself a little bit of refresher. Thanks for watching.